You know what? Let's declare war on nerds today. On today's show, we're talking about FanGraphs' ZiPS projections for the 2023 Padres, at least in terms of position players, which ones I agree with, which ones I don't. What are they saying for new acquisition Xander Bogaerts? What about Tatis? What about Luis Campusano and Austin Nola? There's so much to talk about. Let's get into it.
On Padres, your daily San Diego Padres podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Padres podcast, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day for Wednesday, March 23rd. As always, I'm your host with sometimes, occasionally, but certainly not always, the most, Javier Reyes. You might be familiar with my baseball work over at the website Just Baseball, where I've written about a whole bunch of things, including, lately, fantasy baseball team names. A bunch of suggestions for that, so go check that out. Or you could also find me on Twitter at Javipeno, Javiiipeno, or at LO_Padres if you only want exclusively Padres-related content. And you could also check out the YouTube to see whatever shirt I'm rocking. Just the Hanes white tee today, but still. And you could check out Tatis, my little bobblehead goober, on the YouTube as well. And you could check out a link to this here bobblehead in the description if you so find yourself so interested. Remember, Locked On Padres, thank you for making us your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms. And on today's show, we're declaring war. I've been saying it for months. It's time to declare war against the nerds. I've had enough. Was I good at algebra and geometry in high school? No, I was not. But I still want to declare war on the nerds. In fact, because I wasn't good at those subjects in high school is why I declare war on math. Fun fact, the reason I declared war on math officially is because I remember in high school, my freshman year, our geometry teacher handed out our finals in order of highest to lowest grade. Yeah. Just totally unnecessary, right? Throw the flag. Yeah, ridiculous. But anyway, guys, enough of that tangent. We're going to be talking about on today's episode, we're going to be talking about FanGraphs' ZiPS projections, which came out a little bit while ago for the Padres starting lineup. Or I should say for the Padres position players in 2023. And just kind of using that as a basis to talk about my thoughts and whether or not I think some of these guys are going to go up and down. We're going to be talking about WRC Plus and F4, all that fun, good stuff. So strap yourselves in. Let's get to it. And the only way to start this off is you got to start with Mount Crushmore. You have to talk about Tatis, Bogaerts, Machado, and Soto, right? You got to start out with those guys. What do they see for Mr. Or I should say this horseman of the apocalypse, the four horsemen of the San Diego Padres lineup. And for the most part, I agree with basically everything that FanGraphs puts here. For the most part, I think that these are very fair and safe predictions. I think that the only player that they are super bullish on being significantly better than last year is Juan Soto. Obviously, technically Fernando Tatis Jr. because he didn't play, but that's different. He's the one player that they're super bullish on. So we'll start with him. FanGraphs' ZiPS projections have him having a 6.5 win season. Again, this is ZiPS projections. They're saying that he's going to walk more than he's going to strike out, which has always been the case with him. They think his isolated power is going to be great. They think that he's going to have an on-base over 400, which in fairness, when has he not had an on-base over 400 and have easily the best WRC plus on the team? Friendly reminder for folks, WRC Plus is a nice offensive stat that tells you how much better than the average player a player is offensively. And it takes into account ballpark factors and defense and all that sort of stuff, right? You know, which is, it's a good stat. So say you're 111, you're 11% better than the average player. If you're 98, you're 2% worse than the average player. So you don't want to be below 100, basically. And they're saying 164 for this man. Last year with the Padres, Juan Soto had a 130 WRC plus, which wasn't great. It wasn't excellent. For him, WAR with the Padres didn't matter as much last year because he was a mid-season trade target, so his WAR with the Padres isn't necessarily as notable, although he did have, admittedly, a little bit of a down season by his standards. And by the way, by his standards, I'm talking like an MVP standards. And I think that it should be noted that Soto was still, while he was a little bit disappointing at the trade deadline, so is everyone else that the Padres acquired with Josh Bell and Brandon Drury. Just just not the best. You know what I mean? Just not the best trade deadline acquisitions for the Padres in terms of just how they performed that season. He turned it up a little bit towards the end of the year, but for the most part, just it looks like he got a little bit unlucky. His walk rate was still excellently high, but the slugging wasn't there, at least when he was with the Padres, right? He didn't hit too many home runs, and he had a low BABIP, 249 to be exact, which is much lower than his career average of 309. Not that he's a speedster who will outrun balls, right? This isn't prime Ichiro Suzuki in 2001, but it does show you a little bit of, it reminds me of Manny Machado's season back in the day when he had like the lowest and worst luck for a first half I'd ever seen. I think it was like 2017, 2016, something like that. But yeah, I expect Juan Soto to be excellent. And he's actually one of the highest projected players overall by FanGraphs' metrics, which I think he's going to be awesome. Look, he's trying to get paid. He has all the motivation in the world. And this is why they traded for him. They traded for a guy who these next 2 years at the minimum is going to put up MVP quality numbers. I think that the only thing that prevents Juan Soto from potentially winning the MVP, because, hey, I take this into account, he's going to have all the attention on him because of this Padres team being so blockbuster. He's going to have all the motivation. He's going to bounce back. The only thing that will determine it is, can he revert to at least being an average defender? Being among one of the worst qualified defenders in baseball last year did not help his F4 total. And I think that FanGraphs is probably projecting that. They're at least expecting him to be a little bit better than last year, because if you look at his overall metrics, he was in like the 90th percentile in 2021 when he almost won the MVP as well, when he was a top 3 finalist. And then last year he was in the bottom 1st percentile. So if that evens out a little bit, I think that's how he gets the MVP. He's probably, or not even probably, according to FanDuel, the highest projected player to win MVP this year. So yeah, there's nothing surprising about this. So let's move on. And yes, guys, it's not normal for someone to have a walk rate 6% better than their strikeout rate, just in case you were wondering, which is what they're projecting for him. And that is something he's done before. Next up is Manny Machado, who FanGraphs is projecting a little bit of a downturn. A 4.8 F4 for them this upcoming season. They think he's going to hit 266, which would be a lot lesser than the 290 average he had last year. 338 on base, 469 slugging though. Again, home runs. For these projections, got to keep in mind Petco Park. They're probably trying to adjust for that and say, look, maybe in a different ballpark. Heck, if he was with the Reds, the Great American Ballpark, he'd have 58 home runs last year, right? But I think it's a fair metric to point out there. And even if his offense does go down a little bit from last year, the glove is what keeps Manny being such a high-quality player. And it would not disappoint me at all if Manny hits like 28 home runs, has a pretty good offensive season, but then his defense is excellent, right? And that's what I'm expecting. I will say, though, for a guy that I think should have won the MVP, predicting that his WRC plus by ZiPS projections is going to drop to 127, which is still good, but they're predicting it to go to 127 when he had a 152 last year. That's a huge drop-off. And don't get me wrong, in fairness, Manny Machado has had some drop-off seasons. Even with the Padres, right? Like, he had a 2-WAR season. He wasn't that excellent his first year with the Padres. And he isn't as I talked about in the Nola Arenado video, he isn't as consistent necessarily. He's a very good player, and he's very consistent in some ways, like such as health, such as defense. But with the offense, sometimes he'll have a little bit of an okay year. In 2021 was a great example, right? He just never got hot. He never had that, like, I'm Manny Machado moment. So I think that's what they're accounting for. So I don't hate this projection, as some other people might say. But considering that his BABIP was 337, he did get a little bit luckier on some batting ball luck. He did hit the ball hard, though. Don't get me wrong, he did hit the ball hard. But considering he isn't a speedster, I would at least take that into account. You know, he did also get to face the Giants, and the Giants might, have played a little bit of a part in that, and the fact that their defense was historically bad last year. You got the Rockies, teams like that, right? So it's something to take into account. And this would still be a plus for the Padres, although I understand why some people may be disappointed if the first year of his extension, this is what we see. Personally, I don't know if it's going to happen his first year. I think it might happen next year, that he's going to have a little bit of a 4.8 season. But what do I know? But remember, he's still only 30 years old. Could absolutely be great. And the next player we got to talk about, ladies and gentlemen, is a fun one as well, of course. We're still talking about all the old... whatchamacallits, what was I going to say? The Mount Crushmore, right? Let's talk about Fernando Tatis Jr. 4.6 F4 projection, a 156 WRC plus. They think he's going to hit for a whole ton of power. Batting average in the case of Tatis doesn't necessarily matter, but they think he's going to have the best slugging percentage on the team. 570 is currently what he rates as. Add on to that he's an excellent base runner. He can steal bases. Tatis is going to be, by projections, to be pretty great. I will say, and this was brought up in a FanGraphs article a while ago, that Tatis's projections for this year, there was a great article done, and I understand that every Padres fan, whenever, at least on Twitter, seems to just be aghast when anyone suggests that his first year, not career, but his first year following the shoulder surgery and all the drama, that his WRC plus especially might go down by a little bit. I saw the article say like 130, 140 range when you look at other players who have had his injuries, with the shoulder surgeries and whatnot, historically that first season after. And granted, it's not the greatest sample size. Some of the guys that the article cited were a little bit older. And then some of the guys that were really good, like Adrian Gonzalez, they had like a 10-point drop-off, which isn't that bad. So my thing is this. I don't mind anyone saying, hey, I really just want to see it again. It's been a while since he's been in the game. He's been a goober for very long. I don't mind if people are like, hey, I just want to see it real quick. And maybe the base running, he might be a little bit tepid. This is a guy who's had a lot of controversy and a lot of trouble staying healthy, so maybe he's just going to be a little bit more cautious on the base paths. We'll have to see. And I think that's one thing that we'll be able to take away pretty early from Tatis coming back is the vibes, right? I talked about this on the crossover with my boy, Tight End Gonzalez. What are the vibes going to be for him? Is he going to be bat flipping? Is he going to be doing all that stuff? It remains to be seen. And it's definitely one of the biggest questions for the Padres this year. But considering how much they need power, Tatis can provide that. I would say, though, with the defense is what will potentially keep his F4 total down. We don't know what he's going to look like in the outfield. They're not predicting him to be that bad, only a minus 0.2 in terms of defensive rating at least. I think that they're trusting the athleticism and they're trusting his arm strength. That doesn't always equate to being a good outfielder or defensive player in general, but I think that we'll see. We'll see. Because in fairness, this is an entirely new kind of uncanny valley for Tatis here. So I think it's totally fair to be a little bit more reserved about your expectations for him. But you know who doesn't care about being cautious? People who like to gamble. They want to make the best bets possible. They want to go out there and say, you know what? I'm doing the March Madness tournament. Well, guess what, guys? Guess what? This March Madness tournament, we already finished the real cool tournament in the WBC. That's done. But we've got March Madness still going on, both men's and women's. And now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sports book, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. I also forgot to put up the little ticker there, so let me do that right now for the video, folks. It's really cool, though. Up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line. It's a point score. It's a threes drained. Personally, I'm not a big threes drained guy because these are college kids, and you just never know if randomly they're going to shoot 10% from the field that day. But still, you can do it. And FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss the chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. And we're back, ladies and gentlemen. We're back, of course. Locked On Padres. You know what it is. Free and available on all platforms. Thank you for making us your first listen. Let's continue the talk, ladies and gentlemen. We talked about Tatis. We talked about Manny Machado and Juan Soto, all of their projections, which I think were pretty fair. Now let's get into some of the ones that I think people are a little bit more curious about. Now, Tatis, he's up there. Don't get me wrong. I think that he's one of the, but for me, the big thing with Tatis this year is going to be the vibes. The last one of Mount Crushmore is Xander Bogaerts, the big, juicy, chunky boy contract that the Padres handed out this offseason. The 11 years, the $280 million. It's there. What are they projecting by ZiPS for Xander Bogaerts in his first year? Pretty good season. A 4.4 F4 is what they're projecting for Mr. Xander Bogaerts. They are expecting a little bit of a downturn in batting average and on base, 269 and 347. Let me pull up what he had actually last year real quick. I probably should have done this before, but so that's a little bit of a decline for for Xander Bogaerts in terms of what he did last year. What he did last year is he put up a 6 F4, which was the highest of his entire career, and he also was a great defensive player. He was excellent. He hit 307 with a 377 on base last year, and he's a lifetime 292 hitter with a 356 on base lifetime. So these projections are a little bit low. I think that the big reason these projections are low is because the hard hit stuff for Xander Bogaerts was not scary, but it was notable that he only hit 15 home runs last year. And that's relying on a lot of line drives, getting some maybe batting average on base luck, which he absolutely did. He had a 362 BABIP, which granted, he is a high BABIP guy. He's a guy that can definitely have a lot of speed. He's someone that not necessarily steals bases, but he's a really good base runner. The highest amount of stolen bases he ever had is 15, but he's a really good base runner, especially by FanGraphs metrics. So that takes into account that he has a high BABIP, 336 lifetime average with BABIP. But even still, 362 is a lot, right? And this is only the second time in his career. I'm sorry, that was wow, never mind. That's a bad point I was about to make. He's a high batting average guy, so I think folks are going to look at these projections and say, well, what the heck, you're hating on our guy. And I think they are just a little bit. A 123 WRC plus, though, I do not think is hating on the guy. Last year, he had a WRC plus of 134. I think in Petco Park, considering that he only hit 15 home runs, I think that's a very fair projection for Xander Bogaerts. And they're actually predicting him to hit 19 home runs, which is, about in line or at least a little bit better than what he's had the past couple years. So I think that's fine. The big thing for me is that I think what's going to depend a lot is his defense. Was the defense that Xander Bogaerts did last year legit? If you want to look at it outs above average and, defensive runs saved, this is not an atrocious defender. He's had a couple bad years, though. He had a -10 and -11 years. But he's basically been in the minus for defensive runs saved his entire career. And outs above average, he's either been kind of at the line or, bad. And last year, outs above average, he was at 5, and defensive runs saved, he was at 5, +5, I should say. He was in the positive. So if he can keep that up, Xander Bogaerts is going to have a really high floor as a player. Because I don't think that there's anything that suggests that one of the most consistent batters in the league who can outrun some ground balls, you know what I'm saying, with those base running skills of his, that there's any sign that this is going to turn into a pumpkin guy. This is not going to be Manny Machado year one, or at least hopefully by projection's sake. But it's totally possible. He's moving to the National League after being in the American League for so long. That's a lot of new pitchers. That's a whole different ballpark, right? Petco is a lot different than Fenway. Not that, Fenway Park was Great American Ballpark or Coors Field necessarily, but it was still a good hitter-friendly ballpark. So I think it's totally fair to bring that up. It was a contract year, right? Guys sometimes perform extraordinarily well their contract year. And like I said, it was the highest F4 total of his career pretty easily. With the exception of 2019 when he had a 5.9. And then he had a 6.1. So he's progressively gotten better in some ways with his overall kind of point total win ranking, I guess you could say. But it is something that should be brought up. I still think, though, the big thing with Bogaerts is if he can still be a really quality defender, then this guy's going to age beautifully with his contract, I think. I think he's going to be steady. And if he's a 4-win type of player like every year, maybe he flirts with like an MVP 5 or 6 one, like once or twice, maybe once, then that'll be awesome, I think. But I think the consistency is what I like out of Bogaerts. So while people might look at this and be a little bit scared, they might be scared at the 159 isolated power number that they're projecting for him. I don't mind it that much because I think that he's gotten better, consistent hitter, great batting average and contact skills, and hopefully has transformed himself into a better defender. But that remains to be seen. I still want to see if the defense is legit. But speaking of defense being legit, we got to move on now to another interesting player, and that's Jacob Cronenworth. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not Cronenworthy. We haven't been Cronenworthy forever because this man is a king. And I think one of the more interesting bounce back guys for the Padres this season. Last year for the Padres, he wasn't terrible. Let's be very clear. He had a 4.1 wins above replacement, which is very good. But a lot of that had to do with being a really plus, a really plus defender over at second base. He was excellent. I loved him at second base last year, and I liked that he had a lot of versatility. That was another thing about Mr. Jacob Cronenworth that was very good last year. And while his, batting stuff didn't leave a lot, left a lot to be desired, 239, 332, 390 slugging, not the best in the world, but they are projecting him to be a little bit better. He had a 109 WRC plus last year, and for ZiPS projections, they have him at a very nice 119. Now, you could maybe argue, wow, they're really expecting him to only be 8% less than Manny Machado from last year? Yeah, again, I don't necessarily love that ranking for Machado, but with Jacob, maybe kind of trying to iron out some kinks in his swing. Maybe the fact that, it's year 3. It's the second full-time season that you're in the league. Pitchers adapt to stuff. But I just think that his swing is as clean as you can get on this team next to Manny Machado's. And I just think that, there's a level of consistency with him that I think is really great. And there were some, minor, reports that I had heard behind the scenes maybe that he was playing a little bit injured. So I think if he can just buff himself just a little bit, if he can be 255, 341, 422, that's awesome. And I totally think that's in his wheelhouse. Let's keep in mind that Jacob Cronenworth, and yes, I'm going to keep trying to say Jacob. Apparently that is actually how he's known, which came out from Andy Hellberg a couple weeks ago, who reported that for the Tribune. What's it called? He's been one of the best second basemen the Padres have had since 2010. In fact, the best single season FWAR total among Padres second basemen since 2021, or since 2010, I'm sorry, was 2021 Jacob Cronenworth with a 4.4 ranking. And more to that, before last season, the best F4 leaders among second basemen since the start of the 2020 season were Marcus Semien. Remember that MVP year he had in 2021? Hot damn. Brandon Lowe. Yeah, I know, he had a bad year last year. And then Jacob Cronenworth, with a 5.9 total between that season and a half. So he's been up there, even a little bit better than Altuve at points. And DJ LeMahieu, who had a couple good years too. So it's worth pointing out that this is absolutely a bounce back that I think can be expected. I think that if he's healthy, it should be great. The only question is, he's moving to first base. Is he going to adapt? Is he going to be great at first base? It's a little bit of a limited sample size, but he has played first base before. And I remember in 2020 when Eric Hosmer got hurt, the ground ball gremlin, who had actually been playing pretty well for them during that small season, he had to go play first base, and he had a couple really great jumping catches, and everyone was like, "Oh man, he could play first base too." So while he doesn't have the power from a first baseman, he's still only projected for around 17 home runs, which is not bad. I think that the defense is going to be a big thing with him, and he's going to be a little bit of that Ben Zobrist-y type of player that I think is great for the Padres, especially on a really low contract compared to what he should be getting, which he might get when he eventually becomes a free agent. So I'm expecting a bounce back from Jacob Cronenworth, and I think it's going to be awesome. I really, really do. And I think that Padres fans should not sleep on him, and because of players like him, that some of these projections for the Mount Crushmore of people shouldn't scare you that much, because they are projecting that some other guys will get better. But a player that they're not expecting to get better is someone that I'm a big fan of, and someone that Padres Twitter loves to just bash relentlessly. This guy, it's really weird. I don't understand the Padres beef with this dude sometimes. But before we get into that, we got to talk about a game, not baseball. And not even something that my nerdy ass would bring up, like a video game. You know what I'm saying? Or I should say a video game like, I've been playing Sonic Frontiers finally. Been about to play this game called Have a Nice Death or something like that. What is it? What is it called? What's that game called? Have a Nice Death, yes. So instead of Have a Nice Day or whatever, it sounds really fun. It looks like a fun little indie game. Instead, we're going to be talking about Ultimate Baseball GM, which I am really geeked out to talk about, guys. Have you ever dreamed of becoming AJ Preller? You want to be AJ Preller. You want to be wheeling and dealing. You want to manage your baseball franchise. Well, guess what? Your dream can come true, and this game is definitely for the you. Manage every strategic aspect of your team, play through the season, and lead your team to glory. You're responsible for a whole lot of things. Yeah, guess what, guys? Being a GM is tough. Shout out AJ Preller. Even if I've ever made fun of you, it's a tough job. Let me be clear out there. Even some of the bad ones, it's a tough job. Except for that Bridrich guy of the Rockies who got it because of some nepotism thing. But aside from that, let me tell you got to hire the right coaches and staff. You got to do that in the game too. And you got to manage team finances. You got to scout and draft players. You have to maybe manage some new difficult diva personalities, You got to do that. And you got to navigate your franchise through free agency and all the ups and downs of a very long baseball season. All this in a challenging and realistic game world. Ultimate Baseball GM is completely free and playable offline. You can play on the go as you want and when you want to. Look, I remember back in the day, I was a fan of a bunch of different baseball games. I was a fan of Superstar Baseball on the iOS. It was like a weird kind of like cartoonish baseball game, but I loved it. I loved getting me a spiked bat. It was incredible. This game, they don't have spiked bats, but what I do like from the visual perspective is upgrading your facilities, which reminds me of these old games. This Game Developer Story is what it was called, where it was like you were a video game company. Now this is baseball, which is completely different, but you'd get to see like the office changing and stuff, and you do get that. So that's what I really like about the app so far. So you guys, if you want to customize that stuff, get into it. I'm a big cosmetic guy. I love upgrading and changing the looks of things. I love it. Hey, I remember Ultimate Spider-Man back on Nintendo GameCube, the symbiote black suit. What did you have to do? You had to complete every little side mission and get a gold medal on all the skill challenges. Oh, I did it because I wanted that black suit. So aesthetical stuff is my big thing, and I think Ultimate Baseball GM has done a great job at that. Locked On Padres fans, you can get a listeners boost, a 100% free boost to your franchise when using the promo code LOCKEDON in the game store. So make sure to check that out. To download the game, just visit probaseballgm.com. You can scan the code or just look it up on whatever app store you use or Google Play or whatever you have. That's probaseballgm.com. Ultimate Baseball GM. Start your dynasty today. Oh, yeah. And we're back, everybody, on this here podcast, kind of going over the last bunch of players and their projections according to ZiPS for this upcoming year. We've already talked about a lot of the fun ones, like Jacob Cronenworth, like the Mount Crushmore, but now we got to talk about the final sort of big players, I think. And we're going to have to get through these a little bit fast because I've been taking a little bit long on this podcast. I'm sorry, I just can't stand not talking about these guys. It's so exciting. Hassan Kim is a player that the FanGraphs projections don't love all that much. 102 WRC plus is his projection. 3.4 F4, which would be, if I'm not mistaken, about what was last year. Let me just make sure I got that right. It's a little bit lower than last year, 3.7. They're still expecting his defense to be great, but they aren't expecting any jump in his batting average or his overall offensive abilities, which I think is fair. Granted, just being an average offensive player is what makes him like a solid starter for this team because of the defense, which is fine. They've got all these other bats. It's okay if we just have a defensive wizard. I think that there's reason to believe a little bit that Hassan Kim can be better, but if he's able to increase, or I should say decrease his strikeout rate, and more importantly, he tends to pull the ball a little bit, if he's able to turn more of his pulled balls into fly balls and maybe take advantage of the left field and Petco, I could see something more interesting happening. If he manages to squeak 20 home runs, that would be great, and that would be a huge plus for this team, but I get it. I don't think there's much to expect from him in terms of changing the second base. I think he's going to be fine there. I think he's going to be great. But it is worth bringing up that, hey, I don't know if he's going to get all that much better offensively. The thing in his favor is, on top of the solid base running and the defense, is that, hey, last year was his first full year of just full playing time. His first season in the league, he was inconsistent. He was bad at the plate, straight up. He was adjusting to major league pitching. But now he's in year 3. And I think that it's reasonable to expect, what if he gets a little bit better? I'm not saying he's going to put up even Jacob Cronenworth numbers offensively at the plate, but if he's just a little bit better, that's huge for this team. So I'd be paying attention to Hassan Kim, and at the minimum, keep in mind that he's a defensive wizard that can hopefully draw a decent amount of walks, be, maybe that bottom of the order type of player that can get things going, get things jump started. The players love him. Manny loves him, so I'm not all that mad at this projection, even if it's a little bit disappointing. The next player, though, I think is a projection that I really do disagree with. And that's Trent Grisham. They're projecting him to have a 3.4 F4 season, and a big part of that, now you might be wondering, well, why is that? He hits even worse batting average-wise than Ha-Seong Kim. Well, it's because Trent Grisham's power upside is higher. 18 home runs is projected for him. He does have those isolated power numbers, and I know a lot of people have brought up, you could see on, what's it called? What was it? In terms of hard hit percentage, which I brought up before, Trent Grisham had the highest boost in hard hit rate last year in the second half, which a lot of people brought up on Padres Twitter, which I thought was very funny as like, oh, he's bounced back incoming. But I will say, here's my thing. The reason why I don't love this projection is because despite his speed, he's not necessarily the best base runner in the world. He didn't steal enough bases last year for my liking. Again, they're projecting him for a 106 WRC plus. Last year, for context, let me just make sure I get this correct, he had a 83 WRC plus. So they're expecting him to jump by 20 points there, and his F4 total, 2.1, they're expecting him to make a 1 point, hold on, let me get my numbers right, a 1.3 jump there. that's a big jump for a guy just because you might be excited that his hard hit rate went up. I will say, in defense of Grisham, it's rare that guys are just going to hit below the Mendoza line like this, before the below 200. So if you're expecting a soft increase there, which would then result probably in his on base getting above 300 as well, I get that. I do. But I just think, okay, I just think a guy that has had the same sort of, the WOBA stats on him, weighted on base, for him is about as bad as basically any player out there in the outfield. Cody Bellinger is the only one that's really been worse there. And Cody Bellinger could hit for power too. And he's terrible. And everyone's out on him. So, look, I get it. I get why people are saying that he could bounce back a little bit. What he has going for him is, like I said with the Mendoza line, that's just kind of unprecedented. And secondly, what he has going for him is the fact that he doesn't have necessarily an injury. Cody Bellinger has had like shoulder issues and all that stuff. Hasn't really been a giant injury for Trent Grisham. And most importantly, maybe the mustache. Maybe the mustache changes things around. So I do disagree with this projection just a little bit. I think you're being a little bit too positive on Trent Grisham. But then again, it's a fine thing to be like, all right, can you at least be like not atrocious at the plate? That 13% worse than everybody else? That's fair to expect, I think. Here's where things get interesting for me. I think this is my biggest disagreement with the entire FanGraphs projections. It's Austin Nola and Luis Campusano. Let's try and run through this quick. Austin Nola, they're projecting to have a 2.2 F4 season, as opposed to Luis Campusano, a 1.4 F4 season. Now, they are, and what's weird about this is they're projecting that Luis Campusano will play slightly more games. But the big thing about this is the defensive stuff, and this is where I don't understand. Last year, if you want to go by defensive rating, which isn't necessarily something that will always track year to year, but if you want to go by defensive rating last year, Austin Nola was a minus 5.8. They're expecting him to get 10 points or so better in that area. He was in the bottom 30th percentile and outs above, in framing metrics. He was not good there. In 2020, he was fine. Doesn't always throw out all that many runners, but I get it. Maybe they're saying he'll be better of a pitch framer this year, but considering what happened last year, I'm not all that bullish on that. And for you to expect a guy who had an F4 of 0.2 to go to 2, that's a big jump for me. And for you to be so down on Luis Campusano, mostly because of the fact that in his very short time span that he's been in the major leagues, which includes starting his career off as a pinch hitter against Kenley Jansen in rivalry games against the Dodgers in the 9th inning. Are you kidding me? And then the inconsistent just calling him up, bringing him back down. On top of all that, yeah, his stats so far as a major leaguer haven't been great. But the idea that Austin Nola is going to be a 106 WRC plus guy and Luis Campusano will be a 94, I just think it's too much for me. At least give them both 100. You know what I mean? Luis Campusano has a lot higher of a power upside. So that's just me. I do understand that Austin Nola, he doesn't chase pitches. He might have gotten a little bit unlucky if you look at expected batting average. It was a lot higher than what he ended up having. He doesn't have the best walk rate in the world, but he's okay there. He does see a decent amount of pitches. But I think their biggest thing is he doesn't strike out, he doesn't chase, and his expected batting average total is supposed to be higher. So that's probably why they think he'll be a plus catcher this year. But I'm very skeptical. I didn't see it last year. It was frustrating. He's not particularly fast, and the framing and throwing out runners isn't the best in the world. So I just think that this ranking for him is just a little bit too high, as opposed to Campusano, who, in terms of when he had consistent playing time in the minors, has been an excellent offensive catcher. So I think that's a little bit low, and I think that the numbers are going to reflect that. And I think that these ZiPS projections, this is where you see a little bit of the flaws in them, because they're only judging on his very marginal and really inconsistent MLB experience. You know what I mean? Which, granted, hasn't been great, but it's been inconsistent. Give him a second. Give him a second, guys. Manage him well. Come on, give the guy a second. I can't wait to see how this turns out and for him to be awful and then you all to make fun of me. And that the Padres were right to keep him down and manage him this way. We'll see. There's a bunch of other guys here. We have Rougned Odor now, who's one of my... I talked about this on the Mariners podcast. Never liked Rougned Odor. He's probably going to come in a couple times for Ha-Seong Kim and maybe hit like a couple home runs for the teams, which could be nice, I guess. But he's not that great of a defender. He's certainly going to strike out a lot. Probably going to have some moments that annoy me, but whatever. They brought him onto the team. The big last couple guys, you could bring up Adam Engel, who's going to be an interesting an interesting bench player, play some outfield when Trent Grisham doesn't need to. He's also a minus offensively, just like Grisham, but he can provide a little bit of outfield defense. So that's why they got him, just for some organizational depth. But the last two guys to talk about are Nelson Cruz and Matt Carpenter. FanGraphs is projecting a 1 win above replacement for both of them, which to me, WAR for these kind of bench guys isn't necessarily the route I want to go. They're both super old, but in terms of WRC+, 111 for Nelson Cruz and 112 for Mr. Matt Carpenter. With Nelson Cruz, this is a guy who has been consistent his whole career. He's been remarkable. And last year, let's take into account the human factor. He was on a terrible, terrible team, right? He was on a really crappy Washington Nationals team that then lost Soto at one point. You know, that has to play at least a role into it. You know, you're this old. You know what I mean? You're like, I don't want to be playing on no terrible team. This stinks. You shouldn't have signed there. But maybe that plays a role into it. And then, on top of that, he also had an eye surgery, which apparently, if he was having trouble seeing at the plate, that's a big deal. So Nelson Cruz, as a guy who cannot necessarily play every other day, but as a guy who might play like 3 times a week in that DH spot, I think could be a really positive bat. He's not going to do anything really defensively, but I like these projections. I think they're taking into account being on a bad team versus being in a good team, and the fact that he had the eye surgery. So I think that that's good. And I'm really curious to see, especially when Tatis gets back, how Melvin is going to manage this. Right? Is Matt Carpenter going to be the DH that day? I imagine that versus left-handed pitching, maybe it's going to be more of a Cruz thing, right? They're probably going to use Cruz in the DH spot, and then they'll use Matt Carpenter. But to start, what's going to be the outfield situation? Is that where Adam Engel comes into play, especially before Tatis gets back? When Tatis gets back, I think it's going to be Cruz and Matt Carpenter in those DH spots, and I think that's fascinating. I really do. And maybe they might even put Tatis in the DH spot sometimes. I think that Melvin actually has some interesting bench pieces that he's going to mix and match all season, right? Concluding maybe a Jose Azocar in there every now and then, right? So I think that's going to be really fun, and that's what I'm excited for. He's done it well with the A's before and previous teams like the D-backs, whatever. He's done it well. So I think that giving him some actual options on the bench, some platoon guys, right? Like, I think that that's going to be really fun. And, in the case of Carpenter, I'd be a little bit worried just because he is older, and last year's turning into Babe Ruth, quite literally, last year for the Yankees, short porch, easy lineup to hit in, and, moving to Petco Park. I understand that the expected home runs for him were still great. And they do take into account, Matt Carpenter, only 11 home runs potentially for him this year. But I think he's going to be a plus bat. I just wouldn't expect necessarily a ton of home runs, considering how many he hit to that short porch in right field. It's at least a fair expectation. But as a plus bat who might hit for some power, maybe he discovered something. Maybe that's why they liked him. I'm curious to see how it goes. And hopefully it goes well because, again, if there's a world where you can have Cruz or Carpenter DH, and they've got a lot of good experience, some playoff experience too, that would be great. Really good veteran presences on the team for a team that has not necessarily a lot of young guys, but, maybe with the Tatis, help ease things, I don't know, all that stuff. I think it'd be great with Soto and Tatis, having those guys, especially in the case of Nelson Cruz, Dominican Republic team. They were both on together, right? Nelson Cruz was like the GM of the team, which I think was really cool. I think that pays dividends. I think that matters. But in the end, guys, those are kind of the main players. Obviously, there's some other people that might debut, right? They might call up Joshua Mears, depending on if there's an injury that happens. Preston Tucker. They might call up all these guys. You might see Brandon Dixon play a role for the Padres this year. He might be an interesting bench piece that we didn't talk about all that much. So there's a lot, man. There's a lot to talk about. I'm excited. David Dahl, who's been playing really well in spring training, has turned, coach's eyes a little bit. That's a guy to keep an eye on for sure. But in the end, those are my thoughts on the ZiPS projections for the Padres starting lineup, or position players, I should say, not the whole starting lineup. And that means we got to do pitching. And that's what we're going to do on the next episode, guys. But for now, that about does it for today's edition of the Locked On Padres podcast, the only pod that may be better than the Padres themselves. Remember to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Follow me on Twitter at Javipeno, JAVIIPENO, or at LO_Padres. And until next time, stay safe and, of course, stay faithful. My Friday Faithful homies, take care.